Hello, today I want to talk about a topic that I touched on briefly in my last video, and that is the fact that there are a lot of global protests out there being funded by the banker government industrial complex with a certain agenda that is being passed off as a fight for democracy and freedom for people and masquerading as something it is not. And I think a perfect example of that is to really take a close look at what's happening in Ukraine right now, because a lot of people are totally missing the point of what is going on there. Now I want to start off by discussing a quote from Professor Carol Quigley, who was a professor of history at Georgetown University, and he said this in 1966, and he was also the mentor to US President Bill Clinton. So listen to what he said at the time. The powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks. Again, by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences. The apex of the system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Now he wrote this back in 1966, and he also mentioned that the key to the banking cartel's success in this endeavor was to control and manipulate the currency of every single country, but yet have their disinformation agents like Paul Krugman, Warren Buffett, Joseph Stiglitz, and all the other banking shills out there that they hire specifically to misinform the people, to mislead the people into believing that the governments in these nations were controlling the currency supply. So if you think about this statement and what has happened in the past decade, look at all the interventions by the EU and the West into other countries. There was Sudan, Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. Even though that invasion was rebuffed by Russian President Putin, the US is still engaging right now militarily in Syria. So, what do those 6 countries have in common? None are member banks of the Bank for, or none are member countries of the Bank for International Settlements, otherwise known as the BIS. You think that is a coincidence? Remember, there are no coincidences when it comes to war and when it comes to finance. You have to be able to connect the dots and see that these countries, the Western bankers, are not controlling the monetary supplies and the financial resources of these countries. So they want to bring them into the BIS. You say, why would they want to bring them under the umbrella of the Bank for International Settlements? Well, you look at Japan. Japan is a perfect example of why. Japan in 1988 was the largest creditor in the world. So remember, they're the largest creditor in the world. Now, the Bank for International Settlements is primarily a Western-controlled bank. They did not like this fact, and they wanted to stymie the growth in Asia and Japan's rise in power. So what did they do? They struck the Basel Accord that every bank, every country under their umbrella had to obey. And they knew that the banks in Japan were undercapitalized. So what did they do? They raised the capital requirements for banks from 6% to 8%. They knew that this would draw all the money back into the banks, stymie growth in Japan, and what has happened? Japan has been in recession for more than 2 decades, and a lot of people don't know that the BIS was the trigger to pull back the reins on Japan. So when you look what's going on in Ukraine right now, look at what Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland said, quote unquote, "We have invested more than $5 billion to help Ukraine to achieve this and other goals." This and other goals meaning bring them into the EU and under the umbrella of the global international banking system. Now, who are the we that Victoria Nuland is referring to in that comment? She doesn't have $5 billion in her pocket. Does the government, does Washington have $5 billion? Where's Washington getting that money from? All the money comes from the bankers. So you have to see the bankers are intricately involved in this. And I'm going to play that quote as well from a speech she gave, because a lot of people don't believe it unless they see it for themselves. So this is a speech she gave where she said that bankers were spending $5 billion to bring Ukraine under the auspices and control of the international Western bankers. And also look, when you see this video, what do you see to the left of her? You see a big chevron sign. This is ridiculous. This is, again, corporate sponsorship of government. And what did John Kerry say? I saw a quote today. It said, John Kerry pledges $1 billion in aid for Ukraine while admonishing Russia. Again, this $1 billion, where is it coming from? Do you think he's taking that from his wife's money? No, of course, the $1 billion is coming from the International Monetary Fund. Okay, let me play Victoria Nuland's speech and I will come back in a second.
What began on November 24th as a protest against President Yanukovych's decision to pause on the route to Europe has become much deeper and bigger. After blood was spilled by security forces on November 30th, the movement also became about justice and civil rights and Ukrainians' desire to have a government that respects them, that listens to them, that protects them, and that provides for them. A modern democratic government. That was palpable when I made my first visit to the Maidan on December 5th. When Ukrainians say they are European, this is what they mean. And as one very prominent Ukrainian businessman said to me, the Maidan's movement's greatest achievement is that it has proven that the people of Ukraine will no longer support any president, this one or a future one, who does not take them to Europe. The United States has supported Ukrainians as they build democratic skills and institutions, as they promote civic participation and good governance, all of which are preconditions for Ukraine to achieve its European aspirations. We've invested over $5 billion to assist Ukraine in these and other goals that will ensure a secure and prosperous and democratic Ukraine.
Now that you finished watching Victoria Nuland's speech, did you notice the deliberate use of vocabulary in her speech? Words like liberty, freedom, democracy, Ukraine's desire to be European. See, it's all a bunch of propaganda. And the fact is that Russia is responding to the US's and the EU's aggression in Ukraine right now. So that is why the world is at the precipice of war right now. Now, I'm not saying Russia is not corrupt, because I've said many times before, people know my position. I said anyone in the past, especially journalists that has spoken out against Putin's regime, seem to end up murdered. So it looks like today's bankers are taking the same cue from Putin and killing all the top Forex bankers, all the top LIBOR bankers that seem to know all about the indiscretions and criminal behavior they've engaged in as well. So in the end, what this is really about is about the desire to bring Ukraine into the Western banking fold and to control the country's currency, period. So I've said many times before, if you go back and look on my blog online at www.smartknowledgeu.com/blog, you will see that I've said, or look at my past videos on this YouTube channel, that I've always said when things get really bad economically, as part of the bread and circuses games, that war is part of the equation. That presidents and the political banker industrial complex will take nations to war as a distraction. So it's just part of the circuses that the gladiator games, professional sports are part of, that entertainment is part of. So the sorry thing about it is that people don't even recognize the severity of the situation in Ukraine right now. The funny thing is, in the US, you could probably go out in the street and ask 100 people if they know about Richard Sherman's rant in the Super Bowl, or who won Best Picture at the Oscars a couple nights ago, and the vast majority of those people would be able to tell you the answer. But if you ask them the things I spoke about in this video that are of much more critical consequence to their lives, of what is really going on in Ukraine right now, I fathom that probably less than 2% of people in America would really be able to tell you the truth. So the sad thing is, the circus that is like a big three-ring circus, people concern themselves with the great show that is of no consequence to their lives, like entertainment and professional sports. But the other part of the circus, the wars, people don't care about. Now listen to what a very former high-level cabinet member said, Paul Craig Roberts. And he was a former assistant U.S. Treasury Secretary. And the crazy thing about this is, and although my dad is the only one that can confirm this, I told my dad last night, I said the crazy thing is, this situation, this crisis in Ukraine right now is more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis. But yet, no one even realizes it. And guess what I read today, this morning? I woke up and I went on the internet to see what was being written about Ukraine. And again, Paul Craig Roberts, very former high-level U.S. cabinet member, said, quote unquote, well, we now have missile bases on Russia's border with Poland. If we add the Ukraine, it's likely giving Russia 2 doses of Cuba. And Ukraine is of far greater strategic importance to Russia than it is to the U.S. So the risks here are much higher for that reason alone than the Cuban Missile Crisis was. So he was calling this basically more critical than the Cuban Missile Crisis. He said the second reason is that the quality of American leadership today is not anywhere close to what it was when John F. Kennedy was president. Kennedy contained the situation. He stood up to the warmongers, to the generals, and back-channel communications with Khrushchev. Now, he goes on to say that there's a group of quote-unquote Dr. Strangelove types that believe that the U.S. can launch a nuclear attack against Russia with no consequences in the United States. So this situation is one that is serious enough where it could escalate because of the insanity of the people running the West right now that think they can launch a nuclear attack on Russia with no consequences, like Russia would not strike back. And that is the scary part. And the scarier part is the ignorance of people all around the world that don't even care about this, don't understand the link to the Western interventions and their connection to the bankers' bloodlust to control the currencies of these nations and to control the resources of these nations. So there's a connection. So when people say, I don't understand what this has to do with gold and silver, of course, war will have to do with gold and silver. You understand the intimate relationship of the banking cabal's desire to control Ukraine's monetary supply, then you understand its link to gold and silver. And if you also look at these bread and circus games, when does the political banking machinery take countries to war? When things get so dire economically, they have to distract human beings. Look at Clinton. When Clinton was building these bubbles with Alan Greenspan and everything was good before these bubbles burst, did we have major wars? No, there was no need to distract the people. And yes, I know people are going to write in that there were definitely U.S. military theater operations going on towards Clinton? Of course, because there are plenty of theater operations going on all the time. There are theater operations going on right now that the U.S. military is engaged in that people don't know about, that are unaware of, and I do know that. But there was no need to be very public like this intervention with Russia when times are economically good. If times are economically good, I guarantee you this would not be going on right now. So that is a message. Please continue to connect the dots. I'll continue to make videos that help people connect the dots. If you think about anything in this message, and I'll put some links also below to the articles about Paul Craig Roberts about the severity of this crisis in Ukraine. And obviously a nuclear war would affect us all in the most dire circumstances, and that's nothing anybody wants, of course. So that's why we got to rein in the bankers now and their insane bloodlust, thirst to control money and power in this world. Please pass this video on to everyone you know. Thanks for watching, and as always, remain intensely curious. So long.